The rats. It was a dark and stormy night. The rain lashed against the window pane, and the wind howled through the cracks. The thunder boomed and the lightning flashed over a small town on the outskirts of a large city. In the center of town stood a large abandoned building. The building had been vacant for years, and the windows were boarded up. The only thing that remained was the occasional rat scurrying in the shadows. But one night, something strange happened. A single rat appeared in one of the windows, and it was larger and more menacing than anything the townspeople had ever seen before. Soon, more rats began to appear in the windows, and they seemed to have a sinister plan in mind. As the weeks passed, the townspeople noticed that the rats were getting bigger and bolder. They started to appear in broad daylight, and they began to make their way into the homes of the townspeople. The townspeople were terrified. Everyone locked their doors, and the street lights were turned off at night. But the rats continued to come. One night, the townspeople heard a loud noise. It sounded like a rat, but louder and more menacing than anything they had heard before. Then, from out of the darkness, a huge rat appeared. It was larger than any rat the townspeople had ever seen, and it had a long, scaly tail that coiled around its body. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, and its fur was a deep black. The rat seemed to be looking for something. It searched every corner of the town, but it could not find what it was looking for. Finally, it stopped in front of a house and stared at the window. The townspeople stood in terror as the rat pounded on the window with its long claws. Then, without warning, the window shattered and the rat leapt inside. The townspeople heard a loud scream, and the next morning they found the body of a young woman lying on the floor. The woman had been brutally murdered, and it was obvious that the rat was responsible. From that day on, the townspeople lived in fear. Every night, the rat would appear and search for something. The townspeople had no choice but to remain in their homes and hope that the rat would not find them. But the rat was relentless. It continued to search for whatever it was looking for, and it would not rest until it found it. The townspeople tried everything to get rid of the rat. They set traps, poisoned the food, and even hired exterminators, but nothing worked. The rat was too smart and too powerful. As the weeks turned into months, the townspeople started to lose hope. They knew that they could not continue to live in fear forever. Something had to be done. Finally, one night, a group of brave townspeople decided to take matters into their own hands. They armed themselves with whatever weapons they could find and set out to find the rat. It was a dangerous mission, but they were determined to save their town. They searched high and low, but they could not find the rat. Just when they were about to give up, they heard a faint whisper in the darkness. It was coming from the abandoned building in the center of town. The group cautiously approached the building, and as they got closer, they could hear the sound of scratching and gnawing coming from within. They entered the building, and what they saw was beyond their worst nightmares. The rats had taken over the entire building, and they were breeding at an alarming rate. The group fought bravely, but they were outnumbered. The rats were too many, and they were too powerful. In the end, only a few of the townspeople survived. They emerged from the building, battered and bruised, but alive. They knew that they had saved their town, but at a terrible cost. Years went by, and the town slowly recovered from the terrible ordeal. The abandoned building was torn down, and the rats were forgotten. But every now and then, a lone rat would appear in the shadows, a reminder of the terror that had once gripped the town. and the townspeople would shudder and pray that the rats would never return. Despite the years that passed, the memory of that fateful night haunted the survivors. They would often gather together and talk about the bravery of those who had fought the rats, and they would raise a glass in memory of those who had lost their lives. But as time went on, the story of the rats began to fade from memory. New generations of townspeople were born, and they had no knowledge of the horror that had once gripped their town. One day, a group of children were playing in the woods outside of town when they stumbled upon an old tunnel. Being curious, they decided to explore it. As they made their way through the tunnel, they heard a faint scratching sound. At first, they thought it was just the sound of their own footsteps, but as they got closer to the end of the tunnel, the sound grew louder. Finally, they emerged from the tunnel, and what they saw made their blood run cold. The area outside the tunnel was teeming with rats, larger and more terrifying than any they had ever seen. The children ran back to town as fast as they could, screaming for help. The townspeople were stunned. They had thought that the rats were gone forever. But the rats had returned, and they were more powerful than ever. The townspeople knew that they had to act quickly to save their town once again. They formed a new group of brave volunteers, armed with more powerful weapons and better tactics than their predecessors. They set out to the woods to confront the rats, determined to finish what had been started so many years ago. After a long and grueling battle, the townspeople were victorious. The rats were defeated once and for all, and the town was safe once again. The children who had discovered the rats were hailed as heroes, and their bravery was celebrated throughout the town. The survivors of the first rat attack looked on with pride and relief, knowing that their town was in good hands. And so, the story of the rats lived on, a reminder of the bravery and sacrifice of those who had fought to save their town. And though the town had been through a great ordeal, it had emerged stronger and more united than ever before.